So the talk today is on vendor security reviews, and a vendor security review is just the due diligence process that customers do with respect to third-party products and services that they use in the enterprise. And if you are a vendor building applications for enterprise-level customers, then chances are that you've probably already encountered this type of process at some point to some capacity in the past. And so just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many of you find this familiar? Oh, wow, okay, so a few of you. Cool, so hopefully this will be useful. Yeah, so today the agenda is first try to understand why vendor security is important for customers, but also try to answer and see why vendor security is important for you as vendors as well. So we'll look at some of the elements that tend to comprise the vendor security review process, and then take a look at some of the factors that determine how enterprise security teams go about structuring their vendor security assessments. And then finally, the important question is, how do you as a vendor be successful at a vendor security assessment on behalf of your customer, and how you can prepare. So without further ado, why is vendor security important? Why do customers care about this? So if you look inside a modern enterprise today, you will find that it's practically swarming with all kinds of third-party applications. So anything ranging from HR to marketing to sales and IT, you name it. There's just so many use cases. Many customers even integrate third-party products or services within their own product and then sell that to their customers. So there's definitely a lot of use cases. And in this cloud-driven era, essentially what happens is like a lot of your precious data goes and flows into directions you really don't have a lot of control over. So whereas in the past, a lot of the data was contained on premises, today, due to kind of this cloud movement that we're experiencing, a lot of enterprise data, customer data, is moving into different locations. It's very hard to keep track of. And what's happening here is that customers do put a lot of trust in third-party vendors through these different use cases. And they trust that as they give them their data, that third-party vendors will take the necessary means to secure that data. And so the question is this a reasonable expectation? Is this something that they should be trusting in? And the answer is no, not really, right? Not quite a reasonable expectation at all. So over 60% of all of the data breaches out there are actually due to third-party products. And a famous example that comes to mind is, of course, Target. I'm sure you guys all have heard of it. A couple of years ago, suffered a massive data breach due to an issue with their ventilation system. And this is just one example. There is tons of examples out there. But the bottom line is that no matter how strong your security is as an enterprise, you might still be potentially vulnerable due to the usage of third-party vendors in your system. So that essentially means for enterprises that vendor security should be an important part of your enterprise security program. And a lot of companies do realize this and are spending a lot more resources and effort into building out these vendor security review processes. So with that said, let's take a closer look into some of the elements of a vendor security review that you might commonly encounter, as you are exposed to that. So typically, there are questionnaires, there is supporting documentation, and when I say that, I mean certifications, audit reports, et cetera. And then there is actual hands-on testing. And with all of these, there are some trade-offs between implementation cost and the value that these activities provide. So for example, questionnaires are fairly simple to implement. Any team can really do that fairly easily. But as I shall talk about it a little bit later, the value in terms of getting security assurance regarding the security posture of a vendor is fairly low. So it doesn't tell you a whole lot about how secure a given application or service really is. On the other side of the spectrum, you have penetration testing. So high Assurance, it gives you really accurate data in terms of what actually is going on within the application, but at the same time, in order to perform penetration testing, that requires a lot of highly specialized skill set, and it is also really time consuming. So there is quite a bit of trade-off. So let's take a closer look into each and every one of these, starting with questionnaires. So I don't think I need to explain what a questionnaire is. It's pretty self-explanatory. But basically, this is kind of the easiest way to start tackling this problem of how do I assure myself that the vendor I'm giving my data to is secure. So enterprise security teams would typically put together a set of questions, can range anywhere from dozens of questions to hundreds of questions, covering kind of main categories of security that they care about, depending on their own security needs. So you might encounter questions with respect to your development process. Do you run static code analysis, for example, scanning? There might be questions around your infrastructure and network security. Might be more technical questions with regards to your application security. Frequently, people care about how you store data, if you use any encryption in transit and at rest, and what types of encryption, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if this looks familiar to any of you, but this ugly thing is what a typical questionnaire might look like, and this is kind of why a lot of vendors hate security reviews, is because of this. But it's also really daunting on the consumer side, like whoever has to review the answers has to deal with this as well. So pretty bad. Fortunately, there are solutions out there that keep evolving, that simplify and streamline the process more and more, but this is kind of, and unfortunately has been a very common way to deal with this. And if you're curious to see some examples of what questionnaires might look like, there are some tools and frameworks available. I'm not going to go deep into these in the interest of time, but Vendor Security Alliance questionnaire is available if you want to take a look. So questionnaires are great and all, and are typically a good first step into starting this review process, but there are some significant issues with them, kind of what value they bring, right? So the first problem is that they're very difficult to verify for if you are a security engineer kind of working on the review. You don't really have any visibility or control into who even fills out the questionnaire. It could be a technical person, but it can also be a sales guy, right? Just Googling some answers and filling out whatever sounds best. And so there's this danger, a trap of favoring vendors that give you answers that sound best, but don't necessarily provide the most accurate responses. But even aside from that, there is also the problem that security questionnaires only kind of tell you what security mechanisms are in place and what security controls are in place, but they don't tell you very much about what vulnerabilities are currently present in the system. And that's just by nature. Like, you can't really ask whether there is remote code execution in your application. So it's very difficult to assess these types of questions just by looking at a security questionnaire. So for many enterprise teams, they're realizing kind of the gap with this method, and they're looking for additional supporting materials, supporting documentation to supplement and to provide additional level of assurance to minimize the risk. So the next logical step is to ask the vendor to provide some additional materials in addition to the questionnaire to verify this additionally. So some examples of this could be industry-level certifications like ISO, audit reports, penetration testing results, scan reports, et cetera. And actually, a lot of customers today really care about and value the presence of something like a vulnerability disclosure policy or a bug bounty program, because to them it's a valuable trust signal that indicates that you as a vendor do have an security vulnerability intake process, that you have resources to manage and fix vulnerabilities, that you probably have SLAs and so on and so forth. So that's pretty important in and of itself. But all of these things are good, but there is still a level of doubt there as well. For example, let's take a vulnerability scan report. when you as a security engineer look at it, even if it comes out clean and there are no major critical issues, you still have to ask yourself whether that scan report has been scoped correctly and actually covers what endpoints you care about with respect to the application that you will be using in your environment, right? So the other question is like, is this scanner even robust enough to test for issues that I care about, or how was it configured? So there's still a lot of doubt there, and for many enterprise companies, this is simply not enough. And so some enterprise companies have actually been moving towards a first-hand type of assessment involving some level of penetration testing using either in-house resources or consultants. So a penetration test is essentially a way to assess an application as an attacker would, right? So you would perform a range of tests using manual or automated techniques, and you're just essentially trying to hack the application to see if it's vulnerable to any of the standard vulnerabilities. And in this case, you might probably skip the exploitation phase, and the objective would be to find as many vulnerabilities as possible, as well as to see what security controls are implemented on the application level. And at the end of this type of assessment, you would look at the vulnerabilities that you found and determine, is this, am I comfortable signing off on this risk for my enterprise based on the issues that exist, or do I need the vendor to fix this first? So kind of why is this worthwhile? Why do companies do this? Well, like I said already, it does give you real hands-on results that you obviously verified and found for yourself. And actually, I've spent some time working on a team that did just that, so vendor security reviews that involved testing. And I can't even begin to tell you how many times a vendor looked really good on paper. The questionnaire looked great, but then the moment you started testing them, you found every single vulnerability type there is. So this really gives you a lot of value in terms of indicating the security posture of the application. But even more importantly, what I think it also gives is it really shows the way that the vendor responds to the findings. And it's a good way of telling if the vendor cares about security or if they only care, getting the deal closed. You want to see if the vendor pushes back or tries to get around the findings, or if they actually treat the findings with urgency and work with you to mitigate some of the risk. But that being said, at the same time, this type of activity is very costly. It does require a lot of specialized skill, and it's time-consuming, so it does make the review process quite a bit longer. So it's not for everyone. Not a lot of companies, not a lot of enterprises can support this, but you might encounter this every once in a while, especially with bigger customers. All right, so now that we've kind of looked at the different methods there are, what can you reasonably expect as a vendor going into these reviews, and how can you prepare? So the answer is it just depends, and there's no one-size-fits-all type of approach and solution. But typically there's two variables in the equation, and one is your customer, so the enterprise. You'll have to look at what type of organization are you working with. Do they have any specialized privacy or legal requirements? Are they a financial institution? Do they work with sensitive PII or health data? Then in that case, they will probably require a more rigorous security review just to meet their legal requirements or privacy requirements. Another thing to keep in mind is it's frequently a matter of resources. So some organizations do have a large security budget and do have dedicated teams that do nothing but vendor security reviews, whereas in other companies, they might just be this one poor guy that handles all security, ranging from incident response to AppSec to vendor security. So that will be a big factor too, is their own internal security maturity, but you probably don't have visibility into that directly. But the other side of the equation is you and your product and what use cases you are trying to solve, right? So if you offer an application that deals with sensitive data and handles and stores sensitive data, then you should be expecting a higher rigor of the security assessment. And if not, then you might bypass that entirely, who knows? And so I just want to double click a little bit into this notion of data and the proportionality between a security review, the rigor of security review, and data sensitivity. Because again, if we're talking about publicly available data that doesn't really have any risk or cost implied if compromised, then there's really no real benefit of doing an in-depth security review. So companies might just avoid that entirely. On the other hand, if we're talking about internal, confidential, or restricted data, then this is when you start applying more and more mechanisms around your security review process. And it also will depend highly on the risk appetite of the team in question and the enterprise in question as well. So just keep that in mind. Cool. And I just also want to point out that vendor security is a changing field today. So in the past, this is actually, vendor security is not the most glamorous area in security industry. And so in the past, it has been neglected quite a bit. But I think now, as we're moving towards cloud and many companies kind of realizing the importance of providing vendor security, more and more teams are developing and improving this process internally, right? So you will, over time, see more and more teams iterating upon this and streamlining the process, and this should hopefully make it easier for vendors as well as they go through this type of reviews. And actually, you see some innovation in the field as well. I want to give an example of Dropbox. They did something quite interesting. There is this problem in vendor security reviews where it's just a point-in-time assessment. So as an enterprise team, you really have no additional control beyond that review into how the vendor security evolves over time, right? So like if new vulnerabilities appear in vendor system, later on, they have no contractual obligation to you anymore, right? So Dropbox was trying to solve that, and they did this by essentially creating some security language around this, and then baking it into the legal contract with vendors. So this is definitely something you will probably start seeing more of moving forward, and this is just how the industry is moving. Yeah. So that said, the important question, so how do you become successful? How do you ace your vendor security review? And I think the obvious answer is, prioritize security. The more secure you are, the more security practices you have in your organization, the more successful you can anticipate being, of course. But I know not all vendors can really support that. So what I can recommend doing is just the elements we've talked about. Just make sure that you prepare, right? So speaking of questionnaires, make sure go and find a questionnaire, fill it out, and then have it ready for when it's time to do your vendor security review. Similarly with code scanning, have a fresh scan report ready, have a fresh pen testing report ready for when it's time to do these reviews, because the last thing you want is kind of be in the situations where you have to get these materials last minute, and you're on a time crunch, or you have this pressure from sales and whatnot. I would also highly recommend looking into setting up a bug bounty program, because as I said, this is something that customers really value. It's a big trust signal for people. And as a side note, I just want to say that Atlassian, we have a bug bounty program, and we actually are extending our bug bounty program to our marketplace vendors as well. So if you want to learn more about that and get some help for how to set it up, just talk to me after this talk, and I'll be happy to kind of walk you through the next steps. But otherwise, yeah, consider having a bug bounty program or a vulnerability disclosure policy. That will go a long way. We also have this good resources for our marketplace vendors on developer.atlassian.com. And so these are just some guidelines and best practices that our security team has put together. And by no means are these requirements. We will not hold you accountable to meet these, this list, but it's just a good resources. We know that customers do care about these things, and we highly recommend that you take a look and review them and make sure that you meet these meet these guidelines. The second part that's important for preparing for a vendor security review is, of course, planning. Security reviews, they do take time. There is no real shortcuts in security. So make sure to set aside time that's needed. Like, count on there being back and forth between you and the security team on the enterprise side. Even if you're just filling out a questionnaire, they probably will have some questions. They probably will need additional materials, so just plan for that. And if there is testing involved, plan for that especially, because if they come back with a vulnerability report and ask you to fix some of the issues, remediating vulnerabilities does take time. So just plan for that and then set expectations with your stakeholders accordingly. And then on the final note, and this is something that a lot of vendors from experience have kind of overlooked, is for a lot of vendors, this is a very tedious, unpleasant, painful process. But I would highly suggest looking at it on a bright side, treating this positively, because I think security is definitely something that everyone cares about. It's just, it's a pain. Like it's costly, it's hard, and it's expensive. But in this case, you actually have your customer sharing their expertise with you, through this review and pointing out potential gaps in your system. So definitely take advantage of that, and if they, pointed something out, take it as an opportunity to uplift your security through this process. So kind of wrapping it up and reviewing everything that we talked about, I think a good way to sum up the high-level ideas that I'm trying to convey is through Atlassian Values. And I'm sure you all kind of heard about Atlassian Values at some point, but if not, so here they are. And I think they really encapsulate kind of what I think would make a good a vendor successful at the security review process, right? So number one, open company, no bullshit. So that means that as a vendor, being transparent and honest and real on throughout the security review process really goes a long way and will actually play in your favor in the long run. Don't lie on your questionnaire, basically. Number two, play as a team. And like I said, this is a good opportunity to partner up with the security team on the enterprise side and really be a good resource to them as they're performing the assessment, but also explore some learning opportunities that you can glean from their expertise as well. I think you ultimately both have the same goal of getting the product into the enterprise, so definitely collaborate and partner up. Number three, building with heart and balance. And that just means, don't cut corners just to get the deal closed. It's not a checkbox. Just build your product with security in mind, and that will pay off in the long run as well. Number four, be the change that you seek. So I'm sure all of you as individuals really care about where your data is going. When you put your data into third-party applications, you want for these vendors to treat it in a secure fashion, right? So this is an opportunity to live out those ideas and really lead by example and be that type of vendor yourself. And then finally, don't fuck the customer. Probably shouldn't have said that. Yeah, don't have the customer basically, rather than just approaching this as a checkbox, as something, as a process to pass, really, do this with your customer in mind and build the best product that you can for them with respect to security and just overall. So I think if you keep all these principles in mind, a lot of the technical details will fall into place naturally. So I would highly suggest just kind of having that in the back of your head as you go into the reviews. So finally, on the final note, if you're interested in learning more about how Atlassian lives out these values, visit atlassian.com/trust. And this is where, in the spirit of being open, we've actually published all of the information that I've talked about. So, for example, you can download questionnaires for our different products. You can view our certifications. Even if you want to do a pen test on us, you can even, we have a bug bounty program, so you can just start hacking on our products, and if you find a vulnerability, you can report it to our bug bounty and actually get paid. So definitely encourage you to do that. Anyway, so this is all for me. With that being said, just going to open up for Q&A if we have time, and thank you.